From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. I'm sure you remember the images of Kfir and Ariel Bibas, even if you don't remember their names. They were just 9 months and 4 years old when they were kidnapped by Hamas, along with their mother Shiri, on October 7th, 2023. It was impossible to look at it and not think of the Holocaust. For more than 500 days, people around the world prayed for the safe return of these babies. And our hopes were raised on February 1st, when the fourth member of the family, their father, Yarden Bibas, was liberated after 483 days in Hamas captivity. But as this episode goes live, Kfir, Ariel, and Shiri Bibas won't be returning home alive. Hamas, instead, will be handing over their remains.
The group's negotiator, Khalil al-Hayya, said the bodies to be released would include those of the Bibas family, Shiri, and her young children, Kfir and Ariel, who were aged 9 months and 4 years when Hamas kidnapped them during the 7th of October 2023 attack.
It is hard to explain how devastating this news is. My friend, Commentary Magazine's senior editor, Seth Mandel, explains why in the Free Press. Here's what he writes. In a better world, the faces of the Bibas children would be everywhere at all times. In the world in which we live, by contrast, posters with those faces get torn down from bulletin boards. The crimes against the Bibas family are indeed the symbol of the anti-civilizational menace that is Hamas. But also, they are a symbol of the cowardice of the political and cultural leaders of the enlightened West. It is impossible for the rest of us to pretend that we didn't see a chunk of society, whether in person or online, rush to cross that line and to cheer on the people who kidnapped 2 babies. Baby Kfir, 9 months old when he was kidnapped, he became a symbol because he is the answer to every relevant question about this conflict. As Seth writes, his case is the war boiled down to its essence. Kfir is the dividing line. In a better world, there would be no one standing on the wrong side of it. Before the devastating news of the Bibas children broke, I sat down with Matti Friedman, Free Press's Jerusalem correspondent. We happened to talk on the very day that Kfir and Ariel's father, Yarden, was released after being kept in unimaginable conditions. Now Yarden confronts the nightmare that his entire family was murdered. We talk about the toll of this war. We talk about why returning the hostages is so fundamentally important to the future of Israel. We talk about the rise of anti-Jewish hate, about how to be an American, Jewish, and a Zionist at the same time, and about how all of us that care about civilization are waking up to a new reality in 2025. Stay with us. We're speaking here tonight, right after Shabbat, on a day in which 3 additional hostages were liberated from slavery, really is the word for it, in Gaza. Keith Siegel, Ophir Calderon, and of course, Yarden Bibas. They have been liberated, and I think the obvious place to start, given that you just flew from the Jewish state that Herzl imagined in the 1800s and was laughed out of the opera house infamously in Vienna by his friends. He got the last laugh, as it turns out. What is the mood right now in Israel?
The mood of the past couple of weeks has been something that I've really never seen. The kind of pendulum swinging between the joy at the, these incredible images of families reuniting. I mean, we have people, it's impossible to imagine a situation like this in the modern world where you have people who vanish and you don't know if they're alive or dead. It's like Schrodinger's cat. We didn't know if these people were going to make it, if we'd ever see them again, if they were alive, but we all know them, or we feel that we know them because for 15 months we've been driving, and as you know, if you've been to Israel in the past 15 months, you drive past their faces. You're driving on the road and you'll see the face of Keith Siegel. And I know these faces. And I know personally a hostage who unfortunately didn't make it home and won't make it home, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who is a young man who I had Shabbat lunch with a few weeks before October 7th. And in my neighborhood, I live in South Jerusalem, almost every day I drive past a huge poster of this smiling face of someone who I knew. So we're all emotionally very wrapped up in this story, even if we didn't know the people personally. So there's this joy at seeing these families embracing an incredible happiness. And at the same time, there's an awareness that a lot of the people who were taken hostage will not be coming back. And of course, there's an awareness of the price of the deal, which is in the back of our minds. And Israelis overwhelmingly support the deal. But people know that there's going to be a price. We're releasing hundreds and hundreds of dangerous terrorists, and we're going to pay a price for it. I mean, there are people who are alive now in Israel who will die because of this deal. And Israelis know that, and we accept the price. And Jewish tradition has a take on redeeming hostages, which prioritizes the lives that can be saved now. In mitzvah gdola mipidyon shvuim, that's Maimonides. It's a central tenet in Jewish tradition, and that explains why some of the Orthodox parties in Knesset support the deal, despite our knowledge of the dangers. So it's an incredibly, almost schizophrenic response to this, where we're thrilled for these people and we think the deal was necessary, and we're aware that the war is not over. And the pictures of the prisoner releases, we were speaking about this earlier, the pictures of these young Israeli women in a mob just baying for blood. These images are not being ignored in Israel. And something is being driven home about the unfortunately implacable nature of our enemies and about the chances of a real peace that will end this war. So it's a whole mix of emotions as usual in Israel.
I was in Israel in January, doing reporting for the Free Press and doing all the kinds of things people were doing in the days after the war and going to the sites and meeting with survivors. But I think maybe one of the most shattering moments for me is I was at a Shabbat dinner with one of my closest friends who had made Aliyah and another close friend who had made Aliyah, both from college with me, and we were with their kids. And I was just sort of eavesdropping on their 8, 9, 10-year-olds playing around. And what I realized is they were playing a game about terrorism and hiding from terrorists. And they were 8 and 9 years old. You know these people. And it just struck me in a profound way. And of course, they've spent tons of time in the past months stocking up their safe room, staying in their bunker, doing the kinds of things that would be unimaginable to most Americans. Can you just speak a tiny bit about what it means to be a parent in this? To have 2 twin boys who are about to enter the military, but also to have a young son, young children who looked up to Hersh Polin. You wrote this incredible essay this year for the Free Press called Why I Got a Gun. Give us a little bit more, maybe if you could, of a personal sense, Matti, of how the past 15 months have transformed you, maybe as a parent living in Israel and as an Israeli.
Of course, we're all in that boat, and it was really driven home to me last Shabbat. I was having a Shabbat dinner with good friends who also have kids, and we were having this conversation around the table, the adults, which is just the conversation we've been having for the past 15 months about people who we know who've been killed, and Hersh, another kid from our shul, was killed exactly 30 days ago. Yuval Shoam was killed in the Armored Corps. And this is just Israel in 2024, 25. The son of the guy who runs the Makolet, the grocery store in my neighborhood, was killed in the engineers. The son of the guy who runs the bakery where I shop every Friday was killed in the paratroopers. And I mean, I could go on and on. That's just our world. And we were talking about it. We're talking about people coming back or not coming back. And the kids are, of course, there. And this is what they've been hearing for the past 15 months because there's no way to shield them from it. I mean, my kids literally knew Hersh, so there's no way to tell them anything other than the truth. And my friend whose house we were at suddenly turned to the kids and said, "I'm so sorry." And it was such a potent thing to say, and it didn't occur to me to say it. And he was apologizing for this being their world, and it's a world that we all inhabit. And Israelis, as you probably know, are incredibly resilient, and they've risen to the occasion in a way that's remarkable. For example, I have an 8-year-old named Asaf. He's a very happy-go-lucky kid. He can't remember any reality other than this war, but he asked me a few months ago, he said, "Abba, would it be better," in Hebrew, he said, "Adif liot harug or chatuf?" Would it better be to be dead, a fatality, or a hostage? This was something he was thinking about. Apparently, he'd been discussing it with his friends in class. A few weeks later, he said, "Abba, what apropos of nothing, like we could be talking about the soccer team and cartoons, and then this, he said, what would happen if a missile hit a grave? So obviously he's paying attention to something, and who knows how all of this is going to come out. So it's what every Israeli family is dealing with, and I hope we won't have to, for the indefinite future. But it's definitely where we are now. And I wanted to ask you, before you ask me anything, what someone who lives here but is intimately involved in what's going on in Israel and takes an interest in Israel and the way Israel's reflected in this country, what has surprised you in the last 15 months?
I think there's a few things that have surprised me. One, and I'm sure that many people could call me naive for this, the extent of the bloodthirstiness that you see in those images of people surrounding Arbel Yehud, for example, just to choose one of them.
One of the young Israeli women who came back last week.
Yeah, one of the kibbutzniks. Or just if you really go back and reread the details of what was done, what was done to people that day, I think the extent of the evil is something that I knew intellectually, but I understood in a visceral way. And I think coming to terms with that has been, I think, a profound and shattering experience. And I would say the last thing that I'm beginning to sort of reckon with right now is the extent of profound anti-American and anti-Jewish sentiment on large parts of the American right. And that is something that I said on a stage probably a year and a half ago, and I got heckled by the Jewish audience in the room, which was a mostly center-right crowd. And maybe this one is too, but I feel it's very, very important to bring up because a lot of the illiberalism on the left that came from the fringe into the mainstream of the Democratic Party began as a fringe online movement that a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals waved away because it was just some crazy influencers online. And woe to the people that still are telling themselves that and still believe that the things that Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson are saying will not make an impact on the right, because they will. And I think it's profoundly important to pay attention to those things now. And that's sort of, it's weird. It's like I've spent the past decade of my life so focused in so many ways on the excesses of the illiberal left. Now I guess I'll put the question to you. You're much more prophetic than I am, so it's hard for me to imagine something that has shocked you. But what has shocked you the most over the past 15 months?
What has surprised me, I think that I too, even though I live in the Middle East, I pride myself on having my eyes open, and I've had a kind of skeptical attitude toward the possibility of peace since the outbreak of the Second Intifada. I'm an Israeli. I would describe myself as an Israeli of the center-left by inclination, and I always hoped for a peaceful resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians, and I still would love to see one. But anyone who lived through the years of the Second Intifada, which begins when Israel has the most left-wing government that we'd ever elected, the Ehud Barak government. And there's this wave of suicide bombings and terror attacks, the likes of which we'd never seen. I was a college student in Jerusalem in those years, precisely in those years, from 2000 to 2003, 4. I was studying Islamic studies. And while terrorists were blowing up not just buses and restaurants in Jerusalem, but the cafeteria of the university where I was studying.
And notably, the mastermind of that suicide bombing is one of the people that is being released as part of this hostage deal.
So I've heard, and it's true of some of the worst suicide bombings that we remember from those years. And I've been reminded of the bombings because of the release. You kind of suppress them, but they're in there, and suddenly you're reminded of them. So, but even for me, the brutal nature of the attack on October 7th was a surprise. And I think I kind of reprimand myself for telling myself nice stories about, what...
About a two-state solution?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a skeptic about it, a kind of a reluctant skeptic about it for a long time, just because I've seen that whenever you create a vacuum in the Middle East, it's filled not by peace and prosperity, and certainly not by democracy, it's filled by chaos. And it's filled by these guys with black masks and, suicide bomb belts and a completely different plan about what the future holds. And that's not just in Israel, by the way. That's true when you create a power vacuum in Iraq. And it's true when you create a power vacuum in Libya. And it's true when you create a power vacuum in Syria. It's just, unfortunately, the nature of the region. And it's happened in the West Bank, where Israel's created power vacuums. It happened in South Lebanon, which was the war that I was involved in. Israel pulls out of South Lebanon, and the vacuum is filled by Hezbollah. And as we've seen, it happened in Gaza. So that made me a skeptic. But even as a skeptic, I didn't expect the kind of barbarism that we saw on October 7th. And it's shocking, and it really makes you ask if you want to live in a world where that kind of barbarism is possible. So you have to, right? Because if you ignore it, then October 7th happens. That's the story of October 7th. People didn't think it was possible, so they pretended it wasn't possible, and then it happened. So we have to have our eyes open. But if you have your eyes open, then the world is a pretty awful place. And it's a dilemma that's facing a lot of us these days.
Let's maybe just spend a minute talking about some of the illusions that have been shattered since October 7th, because there are a lot of them. One of them, to me, was this idea of the startup nation, right? That Israel had sort of, which is an incredible idea and true to a large extent, and yet somehow the most technologically sophisticated country, arguably in the world, certainly in the Middle East, was undone by people on motorbikes and hand gliders. How are Israelis reckoning with the paradox of that? That like the most low-tech attack was the most brutal since the Holocaust in a country that prides itself on, well, I'm sure everyone here knows the stats. How are Israelis reckoning with that? And then I promise I'll talk about some of my shattered illusions.
I hope that people are reckoning with it. It was one of the first things that I wrote after October 7th. It was a few months in. I wrote an essay for The Atlantic looking at precisely at that question and at the technology question. And I'm sure that many of you were on tours of Israel in the years before October 7th and were taken to the Gaza border and were shown this incredible tech array on the border. You know, high-tech fences and cameras and remote-controlled machine guns and drones. And we were very proud of it because that's part of our conceit that we're the startup nation, and I think what happened, a big part of October 7th, is us drinking our own Kool-Aid, and we thought we'd outsmarted reality because Israelis would like to use tech instead of sacrificing the lives of soldiers. That appeals to us, and there's this economy where the army is linked to the startup bubble, and there's kind of a lot of heat in that world, and it all crashes on October 7th. And the success of the Hamas attack is not despite it being low tech, it's because of it being low tech. They knew that Israel had penetrated the cell phone network, so they communicated with handwritten notes. And they knew that the cameras were covering most of the fence, so they just shot out the cameras. They took out the cameras with sniper rifles, and they came through the fence with wire cutters. It was a World War I level attack. And the fact is that had Israel deployed a World War I brigade along the Gaza fence, guys in foxholes with carbines, no radios, no screens, nothing, we would have repulsed the attack. Because you can't blind a whole army deployment of people with rifles in foxholes. But if it's all tech, you just knock out the tech. And as soon as the headquarters next to Gaza was overrun, all the communications were down. And for about 24 hours, the army didn't know what was going on. I spoke to a woman who went into her safe room at Kibbutz Kfar Aza at 6:30 a.m. on October 7th, Shabbat, and was rescued by the army at lunchtime on Sunday. And this is all happening about an hour and a half from Tel Aviv. And it happens because we were over-reliant on tech and because we told ourselves the story about us being so incredibly smart that no one could ever outsmart us. And that was the Achilles heel. It's always where you think you're the strongest. And it turns out that the forces arrayed against us in the north, chiefly Hezbollah, which were more tech-dependent, were more vulnerable. Right? If you're using pagers, you got to be careful who you're buying the pagers from. So Israel, can rightly be proud of that. But then how did the same army that pulled that off, allow October 7th to happen, which is basically a medieval, attack where people just rampage across the border, not just armed fighters, by the way, but civilians coming to pillage and rape. So it's part of that incredible kind of, that kind of split personality in Israel right now, where we're proud of the accomplishments of the Air Force and the Mossad and our military to a large extent. And then you look at October 7th and you see this incredible failure where sovereign Israeli territory was controlled by terrorists for, in some places, more than 24 hours. And it does require a reckoning. And it's not that we need better tech. I'm sure that there's some, some entrepreneurs already planning to sell the army the tech that's going to make up for the tech failure. But that's not what we need. We need a different kind of army that isn't susceptible to that kind of failure.
It is sort of amazing now to look back and look at the fact that Israel and Israelis believed that a genocidal group could rule a territory at its border and that could be okay. Like, if you just say that out loud now, that just seems crazy.
I think
and that then they could somehow be bribed out of their genocidal intentions with like work permits, which was kind of the idea.
Yeah, it was incredible hubris. It was incredible hubris. And the Hamas is, to their credit, they're very honest about their intentions. They don't hide them. If you remember the March of Return riots, which were these mass riots along the Gaza fence, which in some places were cover for Hamas attacks along the fence, and Yahya Sinwar, the departed military commander of Hamas, was there on the fence saying, we're going to cross the fence and we're going to find the Israelis, we're going to rip their hearts out. Another Hamas leader around the same time said, listen, there are Jews all over the world, and they're Muslims, grab a knife, buy a knife. And
like the only place you could read about that at the time was memory.org, which I'm sure all of you read and subscribe to. But
even Israelis weren't paying attention, and
but that's exactly
because we had accustomed to convincing ourselves that this was just belligerent rhetoric, and whatever their intentions, they couldn't get through the fence, this incredible high tech fence, so they can rant and rave as much as they want. But the real threat for the Israeli military and for the government is Iran, and I think that geopolitical game with a kind of a worthy adversary like the Iranians, that suited the ego of our leaders more than some little terrorist group in Gaza. And in the end, it was the terrorist group that we needed to pay attention to. Do you think the advent of a new American administration is going to change things for us or for you here in America?
Well, it already has changed things. The question, Trump went on Twitter, said there would be hell to pay, sent a real estate guy from the Bronx, and who seems to have accomplished, arguably, depending on how you look at it, more than Jake Sullivan and any of these fancy pointy heads over the past few years. Looked at another way, Trump is a guy that really likes to make deals, and I was with Mark Dubowitz from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies last night, and I said, I kind of threw him a question thinking I did not expect the answer that came back to me. I sort of said to him, Trump likes deals. Trump doesn't like war. Do you think that Trump's going to do another Iran deal? And he said 50% chance that Trump will do an Iran deal and it will be worse than the JCPOA. So I just think a lot of this is profoundly uncertain. You have things that were phenomenal, obviously, from the first Trump administration, like the Abraham Accords, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It looks like there could be normalization with Saudi Arabia in a second Trump administration. What's not to love? That's phenomenal. But there are other impulses, other impulses that lead to things like, stripping Mike Pompeo of his security clearance and security detail, that are vengeful, unprincipled, and do not bode well for anybody, because there doesn't seem to be any underlying principled worldview or framework. Obviously, we could talk about who the other option was. It was not a great situation here, but I think that the big theme, though, is just this profound unpredictability, not just of Trump, but of the world right now. I feel like we were talking about this earlier today. The center has just collapsed. It has fallen away. And the disorientation that has led to, not just for people that generally identify as political moderates, and I think many Jews do, but for Jews writ large who need the center, right? The Jews do not do well in a political context of tribalism, of extremism, of identity politics, of right or left, of group thinking that demands conformity and orthodoxy, and is threatened by difference. They do not do well in an era in which mobs are popular and mob rule and mob justice. And they don't do well in a moment where people, again, of the right and the left, are calling for the burning down and the abolishing and the tearing down of our rules-based, law-based order. And that's our reality. So, it's not just Israelis feeling it in such an intimate and high-priced way over the past 15 months, but I think, and it's a longer period than 15 months, but I think American Jews are feeling a confrontation with reality and a shifting of reality that I don't think many people are expected, and that I think has caught many people unaware. The phrases, they're cliche at this point, that have been thrown around, this idea that our holiday from history is over, as if Jews were ever granted a holiday from history. But it felt like we were. It really felt like we were. I grew up in a context where there never seemed to be any tension at all between my Jewishness and my Zionism and my identity as a proud American. None. They were all harmonious. Who can say that today? And the world has changed. So it's important to look reality squarely in the face, to not delude ourselves, as you were saying at the very beginning of this conversation, and then to figure out the right ways to protect ourselves, to protect our community, and also to protect the country that allowed for this tiny window that Jews for 2,000 years never been able to experience. So that's, I think, a lot of what I'm thinking about. And two, I wanted to ask you to tell the story of Sally Busby. And the reason I bring her up is because I wonder if you think that she's sort of emblematic of the spirit of our age, at least journalistically. This is a woman who was the Middle East editor when you were at the AP, then goes and becomes the editor of the Washington Post through these years of democracy dying in darkness, and is now a leader at Reuters. And I feel like she's a really, really interesting character.
And in the middle, I ran the Washington bureau when the entire American press corps was misunderstanding the 2016 election. I wrote these essays, and I realize we've mentioned them a few times. They're an analysis of the malfunctioning of the press in Israel. And I gave a lot of examples about the scope of coverage. For example, we had more reporters when I was at the AP covering Israel than we had covering the entire continent of Africa, south of the Sahara. That's 50-something countries. We had more people in Israel. Israel is 1/100th of 1% of the world's surface. Sometimes I say, we covered Israel more than we covered China. And if I'm speaking to Jews, people just look at me blankly. Because of course. That people don't like the content of the coverage, but they think the scope is completely rational. But if we understand that the news is a rational attempt to understand events on planet Earth, then you cannot cover Israel more than 1.3 billion people in India, which we did. And I could go on, and that was part of what the article was about. But it really was about, in retrospect, something that was happening across the press corps, and not just in the press corps. It was happening across liberal institutions. You mentioned the academy. Human rights, NGOs, the ACLU, pillars of the liberal West in the past 20 years or so, 15 years.
The International Criminal Court.
The ICC, arms of the United Nations. They've been kind of gutted by activists and repurposed.
Yes.
And they fly under the same names, which makes it very confusing, but they are fundamentally different institutions with different goals. And that's what I was surprised to find at the AP, that many of the people making decisions, not everyone in the Bureau, but many of the people making decisions were activists. And they weren't interested in explaining a complicated reality. They were interested in swaying readers toward the correct political conclusion. And if that is your goal, then you choose completely different stories and you present them in a completely different way. So if in Israel, the idea is to sway people towards supporting the cause of justice, that is the Palestinians, then any story that makes Israel's position seem reasonable, they can't be reported, and I have examples of that. And any story that makes the Palestinians seem reasonable, then you report it, inflate it, and that's a big cause of the misunderstanding. But it's not limited to Israelis and Palestinians. It's true of American politics, it's true of gender, it's true of the origins of COVID. There are many, many examples where the press really dropped the ball, and that's what I was trying to do in those essays. Did they have an impact?
Did they have an impact?
Since I wrote those essays in 2014, press coverage of Israel has been superb.
Exactly.
Everything, people just read those essays and they said, you know what? this Canadian guy, he's right. And they changed everything. Since then, it's been too positive in my opinion.
It really has.
It didn't make a difference, and I really felt like I was a guy in a rowboat, kind of whacking the side of the aircraft carrier, and no one noticing. But what did happen is that not because of the essays, but because this was happening in a context where a lot of people were losing faith in the institutions. Just I think, unfortunately, quite rightly, that those institutions have lost a lot of their clout. And people can read these essays and kind of explain to themselves why this is happening on one particular story that's of interest to me and to people in this room. So it has had an effect in this new world where a lot of people are just wandering. A lot of centrist, sane people are wandering around homeless, buffeted by misinformation of different kinds, and they're kind of grasping at information that seems reasonable to them. And some people found those essays 10 years ago, and a lot of people, I think, have found the Free Press, which you founded. And it's kind of, we're all swimming toward islands in the ocean, and we're finding each other, and we're discovering that actually a lot of people are swimming in the ocean, and that there are people who are trying to address this problem. So I think it's part of the same process.
One of the things that I have thought a lot about over the past year is you mentioned how institutions like Harvard still has the Harvard name, the New York Times still has the really beautiful font, but the content of it is completely different. And yet the pursuit of truth has nothing to do with what Harvard is about. One of the things that has struck me as sort of like a tragedy of the American Jewish story is the fact that there are so many Jewish names affixed to the buildings of those places. Museums, universities, we could go on and on and on. But what accounts for that? What accounts for, is this something about Jews that we're flawed in this way, that we sort of like the idea of throwing our support behind places that were like creating ideas that were literally coming to swallow us alive and seeming to either be ignorant about it or kind of okay with it? What explains that tendency?
This is a very philosophical question, and I think there are people in this room who are far better equipped to answer it than I am. I live in Israel, which presents me with a whole list of problems, but it saves me a whole list of other problems that you guys have to deal with, like what's going on in the library that my family donated to whatever university a generation or two ago. But it's a real phenomenon, and there is, just looking at this in a deeper way, there is a kind of a repeating historical phenomenon where Jewish stories and ideas are turned against Jewish people. So I think you can look at the roots of Christianity and you'll see some of that there, where Jewish books become, the Jews are kind of pushed out of the story that they wrote, and it's turned against them, and they become the antagonists of ideas that they had promoted. I think you can see it in Holocaust education. Anyone who was following the events in Ireland last week saw Holocaust commemoration essentially turned against the Jews, who, of course, tell the story of the Holocaust but don't understand it. The Jews don't understand the story of the Holocaust. They think it's about them.
But it's about the Palestinians.
Actually, it's about the Palestinians and about the victims of power, including Jewish power. Someone who's written about this beautifully is Daryl Horn, who is one of my favorite writers and a friend, and who's written for the Free Press. And she's written about a discomfort in, of course, Jews donated a lot of money for Holocaust education, built Holocaust museums, made Holocaust movies, and in a lot of these museums, there's a profound discomfort with the centering of the Jewish story. The Holocaust is supposed to be a generic lesson about injustice. And if you promote your own particularism in these places, you're missing the point. So there's a recurring phenomenon. You can talk about probably about communism, and there are other examples where there are ideas that Jews think will contribute something to the world, that will improve their place in the world, and those ideas or buildings or institutions are turned against them. I mean, Human Rights Watch, founded by a Jew, Amnesty, founded by kind of a Jew who converted to Catholicism. But I mean, these institutions, and there are many more examples of institutions that are founded
International human rights law.
International human rights law, the term genocide.
Raphael Lemkin.
Right. And these are all, Jewish contributions to humanity, or so the contributors believed, but they're turned against the Jews, who don't understand
The very ideas they've come up
the
with.
very ideas they've come up with. This is a recurring theme in Western history.